I'm Matthew Rose from Brave New Europe. I'd like to welcome all of you and thank you for participating tonight. I'd also especially like to thank Tim Jackson for dedicating his evening to participate in this Zoomcast. Additionally, I'd like to thank both interpreters, Florian Skelton and Mona Honega, also Sven Bukin, who does the technique for us, and Frank Engster, who organizes all of this. This is being presented by the Foundation Helle Panke here in Berlin, the Luxembourg Stiftung, as well as Brave New Europe. This is actually a bit of a revolutionary evening because after all these years where we've just had people hold a talk and then we have question and answer, Tim has asked to have a discussion, which is actually very nice to break the routine after all these years. So we will be doing a bit of a discussion and see how it works out. We've never done this before. And then to add to doing something differently, I don't know if you know about Tim's newest book called Post-Growth. It's an absolutely, I think, fascinating work. I think it's a tour de force. Very, very impressed by it. It's, I believe, not in German yet. It's certainly just come out in English. It's not that difficult to read because Tim, besides being a very brilliant economist, also writes plays for radio. And if you can write for radio, it's probably the most difficult medium to communicate because you don't see anything. You don't see hands or eyes or faces. So you have to write extremely, extremely well, and he does. So it's pretty easy to get through. As complicated as some of the issues are that he addresses, and maybe, just maybe, it will be in German eventually. I can highly recommend it. Anyway, I'm mentioning the book for the very simple reason that since we're doing a different format, we're going to just start with the film clip. And the reason I find this so interesting for me is Tim's book has a very holistic approach, which is actually what Brave New Europe does too. We take in lots and lots of different elements and try to have them interacting because not trying to sound too, what should I say, oblique. All these things do hang together. And it's odd because about 3 years ago, we have an extensive debate on Brave New Europe about gross GDP, gross domestic product. But that was more of a discussion among economists. And now he's brought it up with regard to climate change, which we'll go into. But first we'll look at the film and then cut back.
Too much and for too long, we seem to have surrendered personal excellence and community value in the mere accumulation of material things. Our gross national product now is over $800 billion a year. But that gross national product, if we judge the United States of America by that gross national product counts air pollution and cigarette advertising and ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and the jails for the people who break them. It counts the destruction of the redwoods and the loss of our natural wonder in chaotic sprawl. It counts napalm, and it counts nuclear warheads and armored cars for the police to fight the riots in our cities. It counts Whitman's rifle and sex knife and the television programs which glorify violence in order to sell toys to our children. Yet the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry, or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And it can tell us everything about America, except why we are proud that we are Americans.
That was a speech made by Robert Kennedy in 1968. And in short, yeah, we've been here before. We're not 2021. And it is with this speech that Tim begins his book. And why don't we start with that, Tim? Why did you select this?
Yeah, I of course. I mean, first of all, let me say thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure, and apologies for disrupting your format by wanting to have a discussion. But in a way, that's what the book is for me. It's a kind of invitation to a discussion, and you'll be pleased to know that it is going to be published quite soon in German. I think September. It's aiming to be published, and it's being published under a slightly different title. It's going to be called Wie wollen wir leben? How do we want to live? And in a way, I really like that title. It was suggested to me by a close friend when we were looking around and thinking, actually, it's quite a difficult title to translate directly into German. And although this sounds, much more philosophical than economic, that is kind of what the book is about. It is a philosophical journey, a journey of inquiry through the kind of society that we want, the kind of world that we want to live in. And I started with a story about Robert Kennedy, really partly because obviously it does speak directly to the question of economic growth, which was a part of my inquiry, but also because it fascinated me. It fascinated me when I first discovered it, which was some 20 or 30 years ago, I suppose. And it was unearthed from a basement in a university in the United States at the time. It was a speech given at the University of Kansas. And it was such a sort of extraordinary resonance for me with the kinds of things that we were working on and thinking about in the work that I was doing at the Sustainable Development Commission, that it immediately it struck a chord with me, and I think a part of what I wanted to do with the book was to tell some of these stories of people, their lives, and their thinking, and the way in which those thought worlds prefigure our own discussions today about the kind of society that we want to live in. And as you can see from that very short clip, it was very clear that, in Robert Kennedy's mind, he had already been to that place where he realized that this wonderful god of growth in the domestic product just is not doing its job properly. And I was fascinated into how he came to that conclusion at that time, 50 something years ago, and wanted to unravel, if you like, some of the antecedents of that discussion at that time. What were the influences on him that made him think that way? What was the fallout of it afterwards? Did it make any difference that the man who at that time was about to run for president of the United States was actually prepared to question the entire economic model of what was then the most successful and biggest economy in the world? And that was really my starting point. And in a way, all of the people in the book, and I talk about quite a lot of different people, they were all in some ways touched my life personally, I suppose, in the development of how I began to think about economics, how I began to think about philosophy, and Kennedy was one of those people.
All right, but afterwards, as we all know,
Matthew, I just got a technical question. Well, I don't know if this is possible or not, but is it possible that I can continue to see you during our exchanges, or is that difficult for
the camera?
Yeah.
I think
okay.
so. Yes, I'll leave it on. It's fine. All right. So, unfortunately, growth won out. Uncontrolled growth, growth without any sort of ifs or whys although at that time, I remember, I was 14 years old when that speech was made, but I can still remember as a young lad, there was a book by Rachel Carson called The Silent Spring, which already addressed this issue. And I also know, because I lived more or less at Stanford University, there was a group of scientists already, more or less making the projections about global warming and what was going to happen. So this was really already a common topic for a while, at least. And it somehow disappeared. And the myth of growth, as you call it, so won the day. And it's we're talking about turning back the clock to about 1968, and it's a difficult one, as you mentioned in the book, because growth is simply sort of become the lodestar of our society. It's a very positive term in life. We all want things to grow. We want our children to grow. We want our gardens to grow. We want our intellect to grow. It's always, grow is good. And that's why, to tackle the whole thing about growth and, take on this myth is quite a challenge.
Yeah, it is a challenge. I mean, you say, well, 50 years on, actually growth won out. I'm not so sure. I mean, actually, the growth rate, the actual growth rate, the actual economic rate of growth of the GDP has declined systematically pretty much since 1968 for about the last 50 years. And so even just before the pandemic, we were looking at growth rates which were much, much lower than they were back in the 1960s. And so I suppose in a way, you could almost say the mantra of growth won out, that we were still deliberately kind of trying to chase after this god of growth. And that actually, while we were doing that, what we didn't notice was the economy itself is doing something rather different. It is, in the advanced economies in particular, kind of slowing down. And we're now faced with a situation where we have invested all of our institutional architecture in a growth-based economy, and we don't actually know how to operate that economy once growth goes away. And that to me was a part of the stimulus, because I think that's a very dangerous position to be in. If you think your economy is going to be doing one thing and you build all your institutions around it, and actually what's happening steadily is that foundation of economic growth is slowly declining in the advanced economies, then you've left yourself in a very, very vulnerable position. You no longer know how your economy works. You don't know how to make your society work, even in such a situation, because you haven't thought about it, you haven't put your institutions around it, you haven't even had the conversation. And so that was, in a way, you could say that was one part of what I was trying to do, was to create that conversation for the world in which we are already coming to be, not some future utopia driven by wild environmental dreams, but actually an economic reality that is more or less here with us already. And I feel that we should be prepared for. And then the other thing that I was kind of trying to do, which goes back to your sort of question of the people and the ideas and whether they worked out or not, actually is to point to a much longer history of ideas. So yes, there's a lot of focus around that 1968 speech, and you're absolutely right to point to Silent Spring, the work of Rachel Carson. And interestingly, it was Robert Kennedy's brother, John Kennedy, who was a big champion of Rachel Carson's work. And even actually, as the champions of industry were lining up to trash her reputation when she published Silent Spring, John Kennedy was supporting her and arguing that this was a really important piece of work to understand. And beyond the Kennedys and beyond 1968, you can look in all sorts of directions and find fascinating people and ideas that speak to this same kind of theme. Wie wollen wir leben? How do we want to live? What kind of a society are we? And that go beyond the simple prescription that social progress is just about economic growth. And to me, that long history Again, it was part of what I was trying to bring into focus in the book. That long history tells us that we are not lost without economic growth. We are in a richer, more sophisticated, very challenging, but actually very exciting place as well.
But we have currently, I think, a dichotomy between the public discourse and the private discourse, because this whole idea of what you refer to as a good life has been moved into the private sphere. And what's been offered is this private sphere, the better life, is guaranteed through, let's give it a name, the destruction of capitalism, the so-called growth, if it's there or not. And this has become really a problem, because I don't think people are able to bring the two together, that you aren't going to have the one, you can have the one, and you don't need the other. You can have the good life, but you don't have to have the destruction of materialism, of consumerism, of capitalism.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm not quite sure if there's a sort of implied question there, but I think in a way it definitely it raises a couple of questions. And the first is whether we can conceive of a good life that is not simply about accumulation and having more. And I think actually, you know, even in the private sphere, there are a lot of people who not only conceive of that good life in a way that is not just about having more and more, but actually are prepared to try to live in that way. It's very interesting. A few years ago, my research center that I run at the University of Surrey, we had some fascinating work around people who decided quite deliberately from their own perspective to live simpler, more sustainable lives. And we call them voluntary simplifiers. Voluntary simplicity was an initiative from the States, actually, interestingly, back in the 1950s. And it was the idea that actually, you know, you could have a better quality of life by living in a simpler way, by renouncing, if you like, the material luxuries of the world and favoring those things that brought us conviviality, brought us closer to our families, allowed us to spend more time with our communities and in our communities, participating in the building of a social life. And that is, I mean, I'm not saying that's everybody's cup of tea. It's obviously not, you know, just like it's not everybody's cup of tea to be a Buddhist monk, but it is a sense of being able to say, when you ask what the good life is, there are many, many different answers to it. And we are persuaded by capitalism and by consumerism that the only answer to that question is the ability to have more. And yet we're living in a world actually in which more is sometimes difficult, dangerous, and even unhealthy for us. If you take the simple example of food, more people die from overnutrition, from the diseases of affluence, if you like, than die today from malnutrition. And that's an extraordinary indictment of a world in which growth is supposed to bring prosperity. Growth matters in those places where we're underfed and where there's desperate malnutrition. Growth is incredibly important there. But in the places where we already have too much, actually, we should be seeking something more in the way of balance. And that's what that conversation around the good life does. I think it allows us to offer different possibilities for thinking about what it means to have a good life. And in the book, one of the places where I explore that actually is through the work of John Stuart Mill, who was one of the fathers of economics, one of the founding fathers of classical economics. And I explore it through the story of his life, because at a certain stage in his life, he had what we would consider now to be some form of mental illness, a mental crisis, a crisis of his mental health. And it lasted for 2 or 3 years. And during the period of that 2 or 3 years, he began to ask himself, you know, really searching questions, exactly that question: what is the good life? What does the good life mean? And his assumption, the assumptions on which he built his theory of economics, utilitarianism, Actually, he began to question those and say, actually, is that right? Does the maximum happiness of the maximum number really equate to having more and more things for more and more people? Or is there something else? Is there a richness that goes missing from the classical economic framework? And that fascinated me. It fascinated me because it was a story about a man who had developed a theory on which we based our entire economic system. And yet at a certain point in his life, actually, it was almost the exact opposite of that system that he reached for in recovering from a mental crisis. So and it was exactly that question. What is the good life? What does it mean to have a good life? How do we achieve that? And it isn't easily answered by economics. It's not easily answered by consumerism. It is a question we have to go on asking ourselves, because it will change from day to day, from year to year, from culture to culture. And it should never, in a sense, be stultified in an economic theory that just equates that good life with having more. We've been led astray by that.
Let's go back to balance, which you mentioned, because we deal a lot here at Brave New Europe, also on these podcasts, with degrowth. And one of the main problems is, you can say, well, less is better. You can say, simplification is better. But as you say in the book, and I think very aptly, consumerism is an addiction. And it's a very, very difficult barrier to get past. But then you come with something which I've seen very little of, which is the idea of balance, instead of just saying you have to renounce. There's a balance, there's a goal you want. Can you explain a bit more about that? Because I found that fascinating in the book.
Yeah, it came really from thinking about that discussion about the good life and what the good life is, and thinking in particular about the work of Aristotle. And Aristotle, in the Maccabean Ethics, offered a kind of theory about the good life that was formulated in terms of balance. So it was very specifically formulated around a metaphor which I think drew its force from the question of health. And that, of course, is a very telling metaphor because of our experience over the last year, in which actually at a certain stage, it became very, very clear to everybody that we had to pause our relentless search for wealth, because there was a bigger priority, and that bigger priority was around health. And health doesn't operate in the same way that the pursuit of wealth operates. It doesn't operate as a process of accumulation. It operates precisely, as Aristotle was suggesting, as a question of balance. And there are two kinds of deficits that sit around the virtue, as he described it, of the balanced position, the place that we want to be. And one is a deficit of less. We just don't have enough, in which case more works well, because if we get a bit more, then it becomes a virtuous balance. But there's another incredibly important deficit, which is the deficit of more, when we have too much. And the point is not to argue that we should all be in a position of having less. It is that we should have a serious conversation about where that point of balance sits, and that the virtuous life, the good life, and in Aristotle's day, virtue was not a moral concept so much as a prudential one. It was this is virtuous because it exceeds our expectations in being good and being a decent place to have. So it was an apt reflection of a good life, that the good life is virtuous in the sense of being balanced. It has neither too little nor too much. And actually, when I began to explore that concept, it became clear to me, how much of a critical concept it is in understanding where our vision of economics has gone wrong, because it simply it takes the concept of balance, and it imbalances it. It pushes us continually out of balance. And nowhere, it seems to me, is this clearer than in the sense of health, and that statistic that I mentioned before of, you know, more people dying from overnutrition, having too much, than dying from malnutrition. Our system pushes us systematically towards that position of having too much, of having more, when in fact what we want it to be doing sometimes is pulling us back from more to the point where we have this Aristotelian virtuous balance. And in the context of many things in our lives, I think you can draw that analogy in terms of our fitness, in terms of our food intake, in terms of our engagement with activities, and this sense that we are being pulled through consumerism into, as you described it, an addiction, is exactly this sense of being pulled out of balance. And it seems to me that one of the most profound lessons from the pandemic was, in fact, actually a concept of health is sometimes inimical to a concept of wealth, because wealth is always going for more. And in going for more, it's always pulling us out of balance and stopping us being able to see where that point of balance lies.
Another author, you spend a great amount of space in the book discussing this, it's Hannah Arendt, and the difference between work and labor. Can you explain that a bit, please?
I think this is she made a fascinating observation when she was writing, and it was written in 1957. The Human Condition was first published, 1956, 1957. And she pointed out that actually in almost every language in the world, there are two words for what we use interchangeably now as labor and work, but actually in most languages, that distinction of words persists. We have a word in English, labor, and in English again, work, and they're used more or less interchangeably. But Arendt said they're not the same thing, and she wanted to use that distinction. And I think it's you know, I found it absolutely fascinating because of the discussions that we're having at the moment around the world of work and the future of work, but also because of, again, the experience of the pandemic, where it turned out that a certain set of people who had systematically been undervalued, underpaid, overworked, and had very precarious lifestyles for several decades before the pandemic struck, those were exactly the people that we relied on, that we needed, that saved our lives, that were at the front line of the pandemic. And so, you know, I think to me, as we think about what we've learned over the last year, much of it tragic and much of it still to be resolved, one of the most important lessons to think about is how we have degraded that world of those people who are actually the most essential people in society, because they provide for the care of the world. They care for us as people, they care for families, they care for provisioning in society. They sometimes are basically doing jobs, you know, which were the worst jobs that you can do, the jobs of cleaning our world. And cleaning turned out to be the most important thing to protect ourselves from a virus that spread itself across surfaces that we were all touching. And so, in other words, the dregs of society, if you like, those people who labored to create a caring environment and a safe society, had been denigrated for decades. They turned out to be the people that really mattered. And I think when Hannah Arendt talks about this category, which is the category of labor, you know, she has a concept of that, which is really interesting, because she basically argues that people, when they're engaged in that act of labor, that's as close as you get to real happiness. Now, that seems totally perverse to a modern way of thinking, but her argument sort of goes something like this. that actually, as soon as you lift your eyes from the task of laboring to survive, of provisioning yourself and caring for people and looking after your world and maintaining it and restoring it for future generations, as soon as you lift your eyes from that, it's almost like you have too much time to think. And in that space of thinking, what comes into the human mind is its own knowledge about its own mortality. So as we lift our eyes from the everyday labor of care, we find ourselves confronted with what is for humanity an even bigger challenge, which is the challenge of coming to terms with our own mortality. And we don't know absolutely whether that's true for other species as well. It's possible, are other species aware of their own impending death? We know very little about that. We know that elephants, for example, mourn their ancestors, their predecessors, from the bones that are left in the ground. So we suspect, that maybe there is some sense in which other species have this appreciation of their own mortality. We don't know for sure, but what we do know for sure is that the human species does. And so we are faced with this anxiety around our own mortality that we have to do something about. And this is really where, in Arendt's terms, the world of work comes in, because work is about world building for Arendt, and it builds a social world. It builds a world of permanence, not necessarily for us, but for our culture. And it builds a world in which we can see the future as a meaningful thing. And in doing so, it mitigates that horrendous anxiety that we're all faced with because of our own mortality. And this is quite a complex explanation, I realize, as this is the first time I've tried to do it kind of speaking, as it were, and I'm sure, I hope I did a slightly better job when I was writing it down. But the really important thing about Arendt's separation of labor and work is that both things have been destroyed by capitalism. The first, because we've denigrated the people who provide that task of labor, caring for us, for decades, and undermined the value of their labor. And the second, because permanence and durability is an anathema to consumerism. If things go on, if things last, if things remain and give us that sense of assuaging the anxiety in the face of mortality, then capitalism is stuffed, because it's no longer needed to produce more and more things. So capitalism has destroyed work as well as labor by undermining the question of durability. And it systematically undermines that durability because it has to. Because if we have durable goods and a durable world, and one that persists, and one which we can see persists, then there is no appetite, there's no demand for a continual remaking of the fabric of that world, the innovation that keeps capitalism going. And so it's a very, very profound critique of capitalism and of where we find ourselves when we begin to think about labor and work. And I think these are although they were written more than 60 years ago, I think these ideas are absolutely essential as we find our way out of this crisis and return ourselves to the kind of crisis of work that we were already facing before the pandemic. These are very much ideas for today.
What I fear has happened, I'd really like to hear your opinion on this, is we constantly have a problem with neoliberalism, capitalism, whatever you wish to call it, which is airbrushing away history. In Brave New Europe, we do a lot about gig economy right now. And I remember recently watching or listening to an interview with, I think it was 18 or 19 years old, someone who was working for Deliveroo. And he was saying, God, my dream is to have a job where I know I'm going to have it tomorrow, where I'm going to be paid the minimum wage, that I'm going to have sick pay, I'm going to be able to even have a holiday, paid holiday. And it was a very, very distant dream for him. And I was thinking, good God, man, when I was your age, this was the normal. That's all there was. You had a job. It was, it was very difficult to lose it. You had to do more to lose it probably than to keep it. It was decently paid. It was decently respected, which is very important. And it, with the security, I have a feeling consumerism wasn't that strong at that point. People just had a feeling more time to actually reflect on life. And it was both, I think, were destroyed simultaneously. The security went, and also, the time to reflect upon life. I don't know how you see that.
I think there is some truth to that. I think they were almost destroyed, if you like, in the same process, which is what I would call the immiseration of labor through the way that capitalism works. And I think it's it's very interesting actually that we're having this conversation in the context of Rosa Luxemburg's Stiftung, because actually these were ideas that she wrote about in the accumulation of capital, and one of the kind of paradoxes that she identified in the accumulation of capital was quite precisely the way in which you could only really accumulate capital by bringing it from somewhere else and taking it from somewhere else. And whether that's taking it from the people who work for you because you want labor to be cheaper and cheaper and more productive all the time, whether it's taking from natural resources, whether it's taken from exploited lands. Rosa Luxemburg's argument was essentially that these were the only ways in which it was possible to accumulate capital, which was why capitalism was fundamentally not only immoral in the sense of being able to enrich some people only at the expense of others, but that it was ultimately destined to fail because there was going to reach a point where you just couldn't take any more in order to accumulate more. Now, I talk a little bit in the book about how that isn't entirely correct. There's one element of that which is an appeal, if you like, to human ingenuity. It's appeal to our cleverness as a species to invent clever technologies that allow us to be more and more productive. And if you're more and more productive with those technologies, then you can afford to pay your workers more, pay your shareholders more, invest more in the factories of the future that will increase that productivity. And in principle also, some would argue, allow you to escape the environmental burden that you're creating. But that mechanism is a really, really tricky one, because what it does, that mechanism of ever increasing productivity, is it provides exactly that value judgment that the people who matter in your society and in your economy are the ones who are most productive. And that automatically means that you end up squeezing the livelihoods and the time and the work of those whose time is the thing that they're offering: the doctors, the nurses, the teachers, the care workers, the craftsmen, the creative artists, the people who put their time into society and whose time is the value point that is being offered to society, becomes ever more squeezed by this drive for productivity. So it's and that, I think, is such a fundamental dynamic that I believe it's again pointed up to us by the place that we sit at the moment, and it offers us also a kind of a choice. What kind of world do we want going forwards? Do we want to continue with that endless pursuit of productivity, which leads to more and more clever technology, fantastic human ingenuity that creates these wonderful opportunities by being more and more efficient with people's time, and the risks inherent in that of squeezing time out of doctors and care workers and nurses? Or do we want a society in which we can begin to value that time and create an economic structure that protects the livelihoods of exactly those people whose service is most important to us?
All right, we have time for one more question that I can get in. It's going to be based on a quote from your book. We are left with a state whose legitimacy rests solely on making impossible promises which are entirely incompatible with the state of nature itself. believe in the developed nations, we're seeing this quite clearly with regard to the pandemic, this complete incapacity to get it under control. We've seen other nations do this quite well. I think of Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea has done a fine job. And what's frightening about all this is if our governments, and I'm speaking from the European sense and probably the United States, have not been able to deal with this crisis, how in God's name are they going to be able to deal with the climate crisis? And we're seeing this already in Europe. I'm taking out Britain for the moment, talking about the EU. We have this Green Deal, which is looking more and more like we call it a brown deal, occasionally written in German, because the EU is pretty much dominated by German policy. And we're already seeing in the recovery plan that they want to include LNG, also liquid gas, as natural gas, as green. And now they're talking about making atomic energy green. And it's just a question of time until coal is going to be declared green.
We have already clean coal. They don't call it green; they call it clean coal. But it's a technological approach which is indeed trying to make it look like we can have coal still and it'll be okay.
With CCS, you mean?
Yeah, mostly with CCS and different technologies for extracting the energy that lies in coal and so on. So it's it's a technological question. We don't need to go in. I'm basically accepting your point that and I think the point you're making is that, I'm not sure what your point is. I mean, in a way, I accept the point that actually we've watered down a lot of what needs to be done, even though we knew very clearly what it needs to be done. And what I suspect you're saying, and I think you're probably right, is that is to some extent a question of political expediency. What can be done politically? And you're right. I do come to that point in the book. It was very interesting when Prosperity Without Growth was published back in 2009, and in the intervening years, one of the I wouldn't say it brought me up short, but it always made me stop and think very seriously about whether I had taken the arguments far enough in Prosperity Without Growth, was the question of power, and in particular the sense in which vested interests will resist change, and they are very powerful vested interests that resist change, and that power of those vested interests is supported by our democratic system, by our government. In other words, the government is to some extent captured by these powerful vested interests. And therefore, this was the implication of those who raised the question with me, therefore change is impossible. Those people have power and they don't want change. So those who want change have no power. And so nothing's going to change. And I think, what I wanted to do in the chapter, which is about power and is about government in particular, was to unpack that a little bit and ask questions about whether we have reached the end point of democracy. In 1989, Francis Fukuyama published a book called The End of History, because we saw the collapse of the wall, we saw the breakdown of the Soviet Union, we saw capitalism, if you like, with all obstacles to it, apparently as the remaining winner. And Fukuyama was kind of confident enough to say at that point that was the end of history. That was the end of our development. It was the end of our political development. We had democracy, participative democracy that would work, would solve our problems. And I think what we've seen in the subsequent 20, 30 years is that's not the case. That actually participative democracy in Western nations is itself in a form of crisis, and that actually, that crisis was foreseen by some of the most enlightened political thinkers who actually provided the foundations for political democracy in thinking about how government should work. And I mean, even one of my favorite quotes actually in the book is from Thomas Jefferson, who once said that the care of human life and happiness is the first and only task of government. And that's what we discovered during the crisis. Actually, when push came to shove, we needed governments to do what it took to protect human health, not to protect the interests of a vested interests of a powerful minority, but to protect health across the nation. And those nations, those governments that were more successful in achieving that, I think were the ones who took that maxim more seriously, that actually that view of government, and it does present us with a new way of thinking about government, was one which empowers government, in fact, to protect and facilitate people's lives, to allow them to live healthy lives, and to look after not just the interests of the most powerful and not just the interests of those who earn property, but the interests of the weakest in society, those who suffer most. And it's that potential of government to look after the weakest in society that, to me, defines what government is and what good government is. And I think political thinkers like John Locke in particular, and certainly Thoreau, who talked about civil disobedience when governance is not working, they understood these things. And they also understood that democracy is not finished. This isn't the end of history. We're still in the process of defining what government is and how it should work best. And what I try to do in that chapter in particular is put forward some ideas that really distinguish what power means in society and how government should navigate and negotiate those different kinds of power.
Well, we certainly are going to be entering interesting times, but I'm going to stop here because I want to go over to the questions. We have a bloody lot, so let me just get started. Capitalism is quite a contested term. Could you at some point give a definition of it for the purpose of this debate? A non-growth economy doesn't seem to be obviously anti-capitalist. Would no growth mean the abolishment of the private ownership of the means of production?
Yeah, it's really tricky, that one. I mean, I have addressed it in the book. I don't know that I've said the last thing there is to say about it. I very much suspect not. But I think the most obvious one is that we know of is the private ownership of the means of production, that defines capitalism. And in itself, it doesn't quite explain why capitalism and growth are so linked together. I think, and you set that against, for example, a view of Marx that capitalism is a kind of process, and that process is about accumulation, and it's about the interests of the powerful to be able to continue to accumulate. And actually that tells you a little bit more about why growth and capitalism are so closely linked together. But in some ways, it doesn't explain it, because actually it almost assumes that growth and capitalism are the same thing. And I think the answer lies, somewhere in the structure of capitalism, that capitalism's assumptions about human behavior are very, very precise, and that they become embedded in the architecture of the economy. For example, the pursuit of profitability by firms becomes a dominant force, a behavioral force in how firms are supposed to work, and firms are supposed to be profit maximizers, and that's their job in the world, is to make more and more profit for their shareholders. And that's a disputable claim. I think that's the point. When you start thinking about what capitalism is, and you drill down to the identification of those kinds of claims, then you can dispute it. And you can re-envisage it. You can re-envisage the firm as something which actually is a social organization with a purpose to better society, for example, as many firms do. And in re-envisaging it, you're no longer lost in a sort of battle of ideologies. Is it capitalism? Is it communism? What are you going to call it, Tim? Why don't you tell us what the new ism is? And you begin then to deconstruct the simplistic arguments of one thing versus another thing, and you begin to understand what needs to change in order for society to be better. So that's the way that I've approached it. But I think it's a very valid point that lots of people will choose their own definition of capitalism and then argue one way or another. as a result of it. And I think it's quite important not to do that, actually, to accept that there are multiple definitions, but to understand what their implications are for how we can change.
All right, the next question is, how do you explain that we stick to GDP, even though we know it doesn't measure our well-being, defined by education, health, leisure time, etc.? Does the idea that growing GDP will finally also lift up the poorer part of the society play an important role in terms of silencing the call for more equality?
Oh, yes, it does. I mean, that's a very astute question, actually, because it's precisely this idea that if we can have more and more, if we can grow the GDP forever, that means that the poorest can eventually achieve a decent life, and we don't have to think about anybody giving up something. So there is a sense in which that growth of the GDP argument does facilitate the ability to not think about redistribution or about the distribution of things in the first place. And I think that's one of its dangers, actually, and it's been shown to be wrong. It's very interesting. I mean, in the second edition of Prosperity Without Growth, I looked at some of the evidence around that, and in a couple of papers that were published a year or so ago, and actually the evidence is fascinating, because what it shows is that when that idea of a trickle-down economics, a rising tide will lift all boats, which interestingly was a quote from John F. Kennedy as well, originally, that if we all get richer, then at least the poor are eventually going to be lifted off the bottom and find a decent life. That kind of worked for a couple of decades or so just after the Second World War, and then it stopped working. And actually what's happened in the last decades that we're looking at is almost exactly the opposite, that as whatever growth there was available actually trickled upwards, and the incomes of the poorest in society went down. And that's the opposite of that sense of, justifying growth on the basis that eventually if we grow enough, the poorest will have a decent life. And either way, what we do know is that there is not a world in which we are all Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. There is not a world in which everybody is a billionaire with aspirations to go throughout the solar system and blow up as many rockets as they want on the way. This is not a world in which we can all accumulate wealth in the sense in which this this idea of a trickle-down economy allows for that degree of income inequality. It has to be a point at which I think we reflect more seriously on the distribution of wealth and incomes, and that's one of the reasons, actually, I think, for questioning and really almost debunking that myth that a rising tide will lift all boats. It won't, it hasn't, and the planet can't afford it.
All right, let's go in a different direction with the next question. I'd like to ask Tim to talk about suffering and the way in which he uses suffering to explore the departure points for both capitalism and Buddhism, Zen, ontology. What does his focus on self-regulation, meditative practice tell us about the nature of the system change required to move beyond capitalism? And he adds to that, do we need to integrate more critical work on the attention economy into our exploration of the post-growth economy?
Yeah, I think on that last bit, I think we absolutely do. The attention economy is almost, it's almost like it's like what we used to call celebrity culture. But it's become an incredibly destabilizing thinking about and having really rich conversations, because it's so flashy, it's so style driven, and it's so much distracting us from the depth of thought that I think we need. But let me come to the sort of deeper, darker question in a way. I mean, it starts from the point at which I left off with Hannah Arendt, is that one of the tasks of work is to mitigate our existential anxiety, our fear of our own mortality, and it goes on from that to think about this existential anxiety and how we respond to it generally. And I use a number of kind of myths, a number of different disciplinary stories, if you like, about how to think about that. So one of them is actually in terms of how we respond under threat as physical organisms. And there's a very distinct way that physical organisms respond under threat. We immediately suspend certain kinds of physical operations in the body so that we can dedicate all of our resources to the things that we might need to do when we're under threat, which is to fight or to flee. So immediately the brain starts working differently, the heart starts working differently, the blood system is working differently, you're pumping different hormones through your body, and your body is getting ready to do one of two things in a situation of threat, which is to fight or to flee. And actually, you know, the interesting thing is that if that can be a very useful state under extreme circumstances. But what capitalism has done, and consumerism and the attention economy have done in a way, is to put us consistently in that situation where we're made to believe, we're trained to believe, we're actually evolved to believe that we are under an imminent threat and we might need to be ready to fight or flee. And it means we're constantly in a sort of hyper-stimulated state where we're too much cortisol, too many stress hormones, too much red muscle, not enough relaxation, not enough ability actually even to regulate our thought processes properly. So that even under conditions of threat, sometimes it's much, much better to take a deep breath and stay calm and figure out what the right response is to that threat, rather than to be in that fight or flight mode. And yet what we are encouraged to be consistently through the attention economy, through capitalism, through consumerism, through the cornucopia of wonderful possibilities that we mustn't miss at all costs, is to be in that state of hyper alertness. And it is, I think, something that is a kind of endemic illness within our consumer society. And therefore, and this is it's obviously a big leap, but I think it's quite a powerful understanding to suggest that actually each of us individually, every moment of every day, has the possibility to reconfigure where we are on that arousal spectrum, and to engage actually at a very practical level, at a very personal level, in practices that put us in a better state to navigate, to negotiate things which aren't generally existential threats. Sometimes they can be, but are incredibly important places where we can make choices about how we want to live.
All right, the next question is rather simple. There seems to be a lot of discussion around the question, what is the good life? But how do we get there? To me, the goal seems to be much clearer than the way to get there.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. In Prosperity Without Growth, a lot of what I was trying to do was to articulate the how to get there in a sort of pragmatic way. So I remember after Prosperity Without Growth was first published, I sometimes used to distill it for policymakers, because Prosperity Without Growth was written for the UK government. Actually, it was written as a report to policymakers, to the Prime Minister, although as it turned out he wasn't that interested in reading it at the time. But it was very specifically, what do we do, how do we move in this direction? And I used to distill that into three sort of very simple, if you like, rules. One is establish the limits, because we live in a limited world and we're busy trashing them. The other is to fix the economics, because the economics is broken, and you can see that in the economics of care and care workers and the economics of the stock market. And the third is to change the social logic, to think about how our own logic as psychological and social beings is being entangled in dysfunctional institutions, and to work at that level. I think all those things still hold, those three. I mean, I did also then offer 12 policy prescriptions, which people can go and have a look up and have a think about. In post-growth, though, what I wanted to do beyond that idea of practical prescriptions was to think about another aspect of how we get there, which is around how our thought processes work, how our belief systems work, what our stories are, and how the stories that we tell ourselves have trapped us in an old system. And to begin a discussion which starts from saying, actually, if we can think about these things more sensibly, if we can talk about them more deeply, if we can bring them into our society in more powerful ways, then we can change the ideas which lock us into the prison of the past. And so that was a kind of, it's a slightly different one. One report was written for policymakers, and what can I do on Monday was a very common question I used to get asked when I was economics commissioner. And there are masses of things we could do on Monday, hundreds of them, millions of them. But I think one of the things we can do on Monday is to stop, take a bit of time out, think more deeply, and free ourselves from that prison.
Your problem here. We have 3 questions in German, very lengthy, and I'm going to, well, 2 of the 3. And I'm going to have to work on translating those. So I'm going to jump and go straight back to those, I promise. Capitalism was pushed back in World War II by the New Deal and the horrors of war. Through neoliberalism, hard capitalism has returned. Do you want to comment on that?
Wars are always very destructive, and I think there was a sense in which the ideals were pushed back, but there was also a sense in which actually when we came out of the Second World War, some extraordinary things happened around the social economy. The building of healthcare systems, for example, the changing of our education systems, a sense that actually nations had to come together, the birth of the United Nations, the idea of a conversation at a wider level to prevent the horrors of war. So I think that, there are always, through these moments of crisis, there are always possibilities for things to change, to retrench, to come out in the most difficult and dangerous way. And in a way, it goes back to my question about stopping and having a think and not being too driven by stress and cortisol at that point, because actually those are also exactly the points at which it's possible to do things differently, and in which our ability to pay attention to the way in which things need to be done differently has to be preserved at all costs. And we're living through an extraordinary historical moment, and we're actually in the process of having to make some incredibly difficult choices about how we come out of that. And those choices are all still up for grabs in a similar way to the way that they were and have been after things like the First and Second World Wars. And it's clear that after the First World War, we did masses of things badly wrong. After the Second World War, we got some things actually interestingly right. After the financial crisis, we failed to see the opportunity that gave us to change the economic system. And my hope is, and my kind of exhortation is, in a way, that after this crisis, we have to do a better job than that. We have to think more deeply about those changes that will protect the things that matter to us most.
All right, let me start with the first of the German ones. This is a short one. It's more of a comment than I think a question. It is not a question of growth or not growth, but growth to what and of what? To which new quality? The unity of growth and development. Then under that, he writes dynamic growth, dynamic balance, flowing balance.
Mm-hmm. Well, they're both good points. I like both of those points. I mean, I think it's true. There was a lovely advert when the conversation about growth began to sort of re-emerge after the financial crisis. There was a lovely advert put out by Triodos Bank. Triodos Bank, as some of you might know, is an ethical bank, a sustainable bank. It's had really good practices in terms of banking for almost 3 decades, I think now, possibly more. And they had this lovely advert about growth, in which they basically said growth is not just a number, or growth is more than just a number. And it's true, you know, that it's perfectly possible to think about growth in different ways. And the terminology of post-growth is very much, we don't have to think about growth in terms of the growth of the GDP. It's about the economic growth mantra that has dominated our societies for too long, and that there are other things that we can think about. We might actually want them to grow. So we want more renewable energy, for example, in the economy. We want more conviviality. We want better communities. We want more nature, perhaps. We want more security in work. We want more understanding in people. We want more opportunities for kids to have decent lives. We want more care and concern for others. So there are lots of things that we can think of as wanting to grow. And ultimately, we can even think about, you know, the things that we want to grow in a personal, psychological, or even perhaps spiritual sense. So they're all ways in which we can recapture that idea of progress, and if we want, we can attach the word growth to it. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But there was a very interesting point also in that advert, which says sometimes what's good for society is bad for the economy. And that's a very interesting thing for a bank to say, because it's basically sort of saying, it's going against that idea that as long as you've got the economy working, then everything else will follow. Sometimes you have to focus on what's good for society. And I think that comment really came home to us through the pandemic. Sometimes what's good for society is to focus on health, and to hell with what it does to the economy at that point in time, because actually health is the priority at that point in time. So thinking differently about what growth is, what growth can mean, I think is a very fertile way to think ourselves into the opportunities of the future.
What do you see as a more constructive alternative to GDP as a metric for successful economies?
I've said this quite a lot, actually, that in some ways I kind of like the GDP, and it seems a very odd thing to say from somebody who's arguing against growth. But I like it because it's actually a framework, and it's a framework that we use partly because we have to use it in understanding where our economies are at the moment. So it measures production pretty well, it measures consumption reasonably well. It measures the ability for government to do things in the economy without becoming burdened with interest payments. You can do all of that inside the framework of the GDP. The one thing it's a really bad thing to do is to measure progress, to measure well-being, to measure any of those things. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile, as Robert Kennedy said in that quote from the film that we saw. So we've done quite a lot of work on this over the years, and it's a sort of, in some ways, it's a technical question, because it's what do you want to measure your success by? So certainly from some of the things that you would have heard me saying, we would want to measure the success of our society by its health, by the health of the people in it, by the health of the society itself, by the health of the community, by the health of the planet in which we live. And actually, we've got a lot of measures which we can think about in terms of deciding on how healthy we are, and understanding how healthy we are. Or you could call that well-being, if you like, because it's broader than just physical health. It's physiological, psychological, social, and planetary health. And so that agenda around well-being actually has been taken up by other governments. New Zealand, for example, who have developed what they call a well-being budget, which measures various components of health in different ways in the economy, and suggests actually you make your funding decisions on the back of those different kinds of measurements. And they don't tell you the same thing that the GDP tells you. They tell you that you need to focus, for example, as New Zealand did in 2019, on child poverty and child mental health, because in New Zealand there was a very particular problem in the country, and it was performing badly by comparison with OECD countries on those metrics. And so you measure that thing, it tells you what's going wrong in society, you allocate resources to change it. And that's the function that a good monitoring system, if you like, a good measuring system will give you. And it's definitely something that GDP doesn't give you.
All right. Tim, since you call rightly for debate about what is the right balance, and thus also imply that there is a definition of a bottom and a ceiling, too little and too much respectively, if you were to have to operationalize this, how would you go about it? What would be the minimum for a good life? How we should live in understandable terms? What would be the maximum?
I mean, that's a very good question, but one that I can't really answer today as it stands, because if you ask me about the process, I can answer that a little bit better, because I think the process is actually quite precise. In fact, we did some work that engaged in this process very precisely. So, for example, in the UK, there's an organisation called the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and their concern is with the decency of life for the poorest in society. And in order to figure out how they can talk about that, they develop something called minimum income standards. And they develop the minimum income standards by actually asking people, you know, what constitutes a decent life to you? And you can get that answer from people because people understand it. They understand that healthcare matters to them, access matters to them, the ability to see their family matters to them. They understand they need a certain amount of nutrition. They need to enjoy themselves sometimes. And all of these things actually are things that people in different places will articulate in very different ways, but the process is always possible to figure out what those minimum income standards might be. So that gives you your kind of floor, if you like. And then the ceiling, it seems to me, is probably established by scale, because if you've established minimum income standards for a decent life and you want everybody to meet that, how much extra you can achieve depends on how much ecological space is left when 8 billion on the planet have it. And that's going to be a harsh calculation. You know, that is going to have some harsh implications for a sense of unlimited income. And it's led some people who are, you know, heroic predecessors in this debate, like Herman Daly, to suggest very clear maximum income standards, if you like. And I'm not going to set that level here and now, but you can certainly say that some of what we see as the ratio of the richest incomes to the poorest incomes is absolutely obscene at this particular point in time. And so having some limit on that makes a lot of sense.
All right, the next question I'm going to translate out of German. Which social forces lead to sustainable economy? According to Tim, it's a state as as the driving craft of social well-being. In practice, the state secures or actually promotes the interests of capital and growth. Is the thesis that the state, under these conditions, the force to ensure sustainability, not an illusion?
You're kind of saying the state can't do this for it. I mean, the state in the condition it's in is not doing it for us. I think that's fair enough to say. Could we conceive of a state which would be capable of at least facilitating this transition? I think we can, but we can't place all of the obligation on the state to do that, because actually there are points at which placing all our obligations in the state does two things. Firstly, it creates the danger of fascism. And secondly, it undermines the sense of autonomy that individuals have in society. And those are both dangerous things to be flirting too much with. So I think this is one of those things where there's no immediate clear answer to it, but I don't believe it's illusionary to think of a concept of the state that does not undermine autonomy amongst its citizens, but yet does protect their interests in society. And obviously we do within that concept. And maybe it does go back very clearly to sort of Thomas Jefferson, and the task of the sole, first and only task of government is the care for life and health of the community. You know, it's a long way from where we are in our conception of the state at the moment, but it's a very clear goal to strive for in terms of what has to happen, I think, for the state to be a facilitating agent in the transformation that we're looking at. And it's a decent, that is a decent concept of the state. It's a decent concept that we should aim for, that we should strive for, that we can politically engage with. And when the state isn't operating under those conditions, we can and should be waving the flag, as some people already are, and saying this is not good enough. The point at which the legitimacy of the state ends is the point the state stops protecting the interests of its citizens, and that's the point at which civil disobedience actually has to start, to make clear that the state is no longer acting in a legitimate way in society.
I guess this was also the definition of neoliberalism, that before the state was there to protect democracy from the markets. In the meantime, it's in neoliberalism, the state is there to protect the markets from democracies. So let's move on. Tim has made clear how capitalist mechanisms, exploitation, accumulation, manifest themselves in the lives of most of the world's people. The question of the good life at the individual level is very important. However, due to the increasing monopolization, there's an interweaving with politics that prevents it from promoting the good life and managing, for example, climate change. The freedom to live the good life is politically constrained. So is there a political dimension in your book that addresses how people who want to live and economically act in a new way should organize?
There's not a direct prescription in my book, but as I think, as I hope our discussion of the questions around governance and the legitimacy of governance makes very clear, there's a sort of implicit sense that that change is needed, and that there are certain kinds of change that we can engage in, that some people are already engaging in. I mean, 2019, for example, was an extraordinary year, even though it's been now, if you like, kind of almost hidden from view because of 2020. 2019 was a year in which there was an enormous upsurge of civil concern about climate change, about extinction of species, and the need for the transition to a net zero carbon economy. And so, that is one of the things that I talk about in the book, how that's an important process. But I also talk about how that is in juxtaposition to the way we have to rethink the architecture of the market and the architecture of the state. And also, I think, what the other thing I try and do is to sort of empower people to think, well, it's, you don't have to wait for all these changes. You can act now in your own life as a citizen, in the way that you live your life, the choices that you accept and the ones that you resist, the politics that you accept and the politics that you resist. And I believe that we should be going into a situation, into a society, into a time in history where those conversations are as intense as they have ever been in the late modern history of capitalism, a place where actually everything should be up for grabs, the way we live our lives, the way we think about ourselves, our understanding of our own psyche, the tolerance of governments that do or don't do their job properly, and so on, the way we think about work, the way we think about culture, the way we think about time itself, actually is in that way, what I hope the book does is stimulate a conversation and understanding that this is actually an exciting time to be alive, because these conversations that we must have are actually fundamental conversations in understanding the human condition as well. We don't just think about changing the world, we might even understand how to live better lives.
This squeeze, and therefore abuse of nature, care, and much more beyond global GDP, which Luxemburg analyzed as the first theorist, is intrinsic in capitalism. Yes, in any market mechanism, because the competition forces to be cheaper than others. States can limit it, but market forces are stronger. History proved this too. Otherwise, Kennedy and many, many others would have had more success. So what makes you believe we could just decide to stop growth and exploitation?
Nothing. I don't believe that we could just stop growth and exploitation. I believe that we are engaged, whether we like it or not, in what may well be a never-ending struggle. And that is our task to engage in that struggle with integrity, with an informed sense of history, with all of the support that those rich individuals throughout history, who I myself have drawn on, bring to our own culture. And from that we begin to see that another culture is possible, that we are not resigned to exploitation for exploitation's sake as the vision of social progress. That's not to say that we're going to get rid of exploitation overnight. It's not. I'm not. You know, I've been doing this for quite a long time now. So my attempts to persuade governments to think more seriously about the kind of economic model never at any point resulted in anyone in government turning around and say to me, "Thanks, Tim, that's great. We're going to turn down the dial tomorrow. There'll be no more growth the week after, so don't worry about it." I mean, actually, you know, paradoxically, they didn't need to do that, because, as I was saying at the beginning, growth is not as fundamental in terms of the organization of our economy as we thought it would be, because of the forces of a secular stagnation. And our task, you know, is in some ways very simple to understand, to wake up, to open our eyes, to see this is where we are. This is the challenge of today. It's not how to grow more and more. It's how to have a different sense of social progress and organize our economies better. And that's, I think, we can do. You know, that's it's not almost, it doesn't matter whether we can do it or not, because I think we have to.
Which leads to the next question. If you could advise the next German government, which 3 policy recommendations would you make?
I'm just going to get my notebook, actually, because I did this one this afternoon. I saw this exam question earlier on, and so I just want to. He gave me some more warning of it. You know, he didn't just throw it at me halfway through a very long evening in the middle of a bunch of questions that I didn't know how to answer. They asked me, you know, if it was very interesting, and the podcast was done by Rob Hopkins, who was one of the founders of the Transition Towns Network, and so you'll be able to listen to it in a few weeks' time, whenever it comes out. But he has this wonderful construct called the Ministry of Imagination, and then he appoints this podcast interviewee as a minister of imagination. So this afternoon, I was able to be, for a very short space of time, a minister of imagination, working in a wonderful building in London called the Ministry of Imagination, which was always full of sunshine, bright, happy people, and lots of wonderful ideas. And he told me that if I had these 3 things, if I told him what these 3 things were, he would begin to implement them this afternoon. So actually, I guess I've got a couple of possibilities here. One, because I could just refuse to answer that question and say, listen to Rob's podcast. The other is to say it doesn't really matter, because I've already told Rob and he's going to implement them. So, you know, we don't need to discuss them here. But I could just give you a clue about the top one, which to me was really quite important, was that I would say that the Department of Health is a more important place than the Treasury. And it seems very, very simple, but it actually speaks right to that question of you know, what matters in terms of the way that we organize society. And the hierarchy of government very often goes from you know, the head of government to the Treasury to all the other departments cascaded beneath them, and somewhere in the bottom rungs is health and education. They don't matter that much, for goodness sake. Overseas affairs, foreign affairs, Treasury, these are the top posts. These are what you want. Home Office, if you must. Please don't worry us with health, environment, and education. And so I think, you know, I think it's really important to think more systematically about which parts of government actually hold the power and the ability to think about society and about the kind of society we want. And I'm not going to tell you the others, because that would spoil Rob's podcast, but you can go and listen to it. Someone will be able to put a link to what the podcast is called, because it's just slipped my mind at the moment. But it was a kind of interesting conversation. And of course it matters to go in and be able to say, you know, what can I do on Monday? That's what we were talking about before. But it has to go beyond that. It doesn't really matter what Tim thinks we should do on Monday. What matters is the conversation that gives us the possibilities to put in place many of these essential policies that we already know have to happen to make lives more equal, to value work better, to stop the dreadful misuse of financial markets for speculative gain, which undermines the security of our economy as a whole. All of these things matter. But I do think I kind of like this idea that the Ministry of Health displaces the Treasury as the most important ministry. Take it or leave it.
All right, 2 and 3 will not be revealed. Next question. Did the golden age of welfare, was it anything else but a class compromise made possible by post-colonial exploitation, just as Luxembourg had analyzed it?
I'm not sure it's fair to say that Luxembourg would have said that the age of social welfare was that. I mean, I think that's a stronger claim than Luxembourg is making. I think to some extent, the idea of social welfare and a social economy and an economy of social welfare actually it goes against the grain of capitalism. It's been one of those, it's what Thomas Kuhn would have called a kind of auxiliary hypothesis. So Thomas Kuhn was a philosopher of science, and he sort of said that our understanding of the world works in terms of revolutions. So one moment we think science looks like this, and then there's this kind of revolution of science when this theory proves to be not working very well, and that actually we then move to a different kind of society. But in the process, at the point at which you've understood that your first theory isn't working very well, what happens is the theory tries to defend itself by introducing what he called auxiliary hypotheses. And I think this idea that we sort of mitigate the worst ravages of capitalism and neoliberalism and consumerism through an economy of social welfare is countercultural to the logic of capitalism, and is an auxiliary hypothesis in terms of where we understand ourselves to be at this time. And I think as an auxiliary hypothesis, one of the functions of the auxiliary hypothesis is to point us towards the theory that is yet to come. And so I would resist the idea, I think, that that conception was only possible through exploitation of other people and the planet. I think we do have an enormous challenge to reconfigure that vision of social welfare beyond capitalism. But I think that's a very clear, definable task, and in some ways it's one that the book is trying to contribute to.
All right. Climate emergency seems to require decarbonization through global multi-state coordination, verging on authoritarianism. Is there an opening for degrowth-inspired social movements to meet the demands of timescales?
So what was the question, Matthew? I wasn't quite clear what the question was there.
Is there an opening for degrowth-inspired social movements to meet the demands of timescales? In other words, is a possibility of the people implementing, I think, policies and not having to wait for government, or letting government use their authority to decarbonize, to go over into authoritarianism. A lot of what is being debated right now about how the government is dealing with the pandemic.
Yeah, no, I mean, I do think that those movements and degrowth, Extinction Rebellion, the movement of the school strikes for the future, all of those were illustrations, examples of places where society can express its desire for change, and to some extent it can engage in change. If the question is kind of asking, is that enough? I'm not sure that it is, because I think one of the difficulties is that you have to actually have some response to those calls, so that people on the streets, even if they're blocking the traffic for a very long time, or refusing to go to school on a Friday for a very long time, or even if they're attracting millions of people, young people in particular, who are all asking for that same kind of change, they must inevitably come up against the architecture and the institutions of the state, and those must be responsive to their call. So can degrowth lift itself up by its bootstraps? I would say probably only in a post-apocalyptic situation, actually what we desperately need now is the collaboration between those voices of civil disobedience and the power structures that live in our governments to come together, if you like, and precisely to avoid that post-apocalypse situation that in which we would have to lift ourselves up our bootstraps. I think, you know, a part of what really concerns me and drives me as a scientist and as a writer is a sense that of how fragile society itself is. And we don't have to go back very far to remember bits of our own societies that were brutish and cruel and are not part of a vision of social progress, and that actually protecting the processes that keep society on track and allow us to stay civilized really, really matters. And I think for me, that's why it's still worth rescuing the concept of the state as an actor in those circumstances, and not saying this has to always only be about, you know, social movements being able to create this change by themselves. I think the state still matters to us, as does in some form the market institutions within which those two things are navigating their relationship. All of those things have to be involved in transformation.
The next question I'm going to paraphrase that we get on. Alfred Muller, I'm sorry if I get this wrong, I'll do my best. The question is more or less, what do you think about either green production and continuing growth and just carrying on being able to substitute everything with green solutions?
I think that is probably that is an illusion. I mean, it's not a bad illusion. Interestingly, I think I could say with some honesty that that's kind of probably where I started out in my career. I wrote a book in 1996 called Material Concerns that was very much about the vision that's nowadays called the circular economy. And a lot of the solutions in the book were solutions that spoke about how our technological ingenuity could solve many of the problems that we were facing and are still facing. And that remains true. There is a powerful, important role for technology. What changed for me, at least over those years of working, was a sort of understanding that actually those technological solutions quite often exist. They're quite often even economic. They work economically. They're sometimes easily available, and yet they're not happening. And they're not happening because change is not just about technology. And it was that deeper interest in how the economy is working that led to some of my work with the Sustainable Development Commission and the questioning of the growth model itself, because I would come up against a situation in which, you know, it was the pursuit of growth that was driving decision making rather than the appropriateness or even the cleverness of the technology itself. So it's a very tempting belief that, you know, that we're incredibly clever as a species, and so we can technologize our way out of all these things and call it green growth or clean growth or smart growth or whatever we would like to call it. And I think it's a misunderstanding. I think it's preventing us from seeing that there is deeper structural work to be done, and that I think is holding up our progress towards the kind of society we need.
Does climate change give us enough time for a never-ending story of social progress?
Again, I don't know. I mean, sorry, so many questions I don't know the answer to. You'd think I'd written that book and I would know all these answers, but I just don't. Sorry. I mean, it's a really, I mean, again, I got asked this quite a lot after Prosperity Without Grace was published. You know, is there time for this? It's you're talking about serious rethinking. We never know how much time there is. We never know how much time we have as individuals, as a society, as a culture. I think that, you know, that's a part of what gives us this sense of anxiety and the, you know, the rabbit in the headlights sense of, do I fight here or do I just run for my life? And actually, it's exactly the point at which you have to kind of take a deep breath and actually make a more informed decision about what's the thing that I can do right now. What can be done right now? What can we work on right now? What are the problems that we can address right now? And that's to some extent, why the book is so kind of wide ranging, because it turns out there's masses of things we can do right now. And the one question it doesn't answer is how much time we have to do them in. But that is a question that is never answered for us, either at the individual or the collective level. So it doesn't change the imperative to act. It doesn't change the imperative to be engaged. It just means that we have to suspend our desire for knowing what's going to happen as the outcome, and yet still engage in the process.
All right, I think we're going to slowly close the program. Let's go on with a couple of more questions beforehand. Have you ever been at the World Economic Forum? Have you ever had the chance to converse and discuss your political economic framework with members of dominant classes, such as monarchs or billionaires, and with functional elites, head of government, central bankers, international organizations, high bureaucrats, etc.? If yes, what do they think about it?
Yeah, I have been at the World Economic Forum. Actually, the beginning of the book, you said it started with Robert Kennedy, but there's a prologue which actually starts in Davos, in Switzerland, at the what might well turn out to be kind of last in its form meeting of the World Economic Forum. And I was invited there, interestingly, by a bank to address the question, is growth an illusion? So I suppose, the answer to the question, what do they think about it? Is, when over the years that I've been talking about this, I've been continually surprised by the people who want to have the conversation. And they're not the most obvious people. They're not the kind of necessarily the environmentalists or the revolutionaries. They are sometimes the bankers. They are sometimes the people trying to put parliamentary consensus together. They are sometimes leaders at the UN. And no, it's never been an easy conversation. But I would say that the tone of the conversation, I'd kind of like to say that it's got more receptive. And in some ways, I think it probably has. But there was always a sense when I talked to people from those spheres that they didn't have an obvious way to dismiss what I've been saying. And I kind of, in some circumstances, because in financial markets, for example, in investment banks, you have people who are pretty bright. They may be a bit fixated on money and money markets, and we might want to hold that against them under certain circumstances, but they're incredibly intelligent people who really can understand, as well as you and I can, that, massive expansion of material demands on a finite planet just doesn't work. And so you have to begin to think about the deeper conversation. And so I've never, ever been anywhere where it's been totally impossible to, maybe one occasion, maybe when Prosperity Without Growth is published. And I went to the Treasury actually at that point in time, and I spoke to the special advisor to the Treasurer, to the Chancellor at that point. And the guy, it was very funny. It was really funny in retrospect. I mean, tragic as well. But he listened to me very carefully as I set out all these arguments. And he says, that's interesting, Tim. What's it going to be like when we turn up at the G7 summit and our GDP is no longer within the 7 top GDPs in the world? What are we going to do when we're not able to claim this position of status and growth and power on the basis of the biggest economy in the world? And it was, to me, it was kind of very revealing. He basically didn't ask me very much after that or beyond that, and I remember kind of making my excuses quite early and leaving because I wasn't sure I was really getting anywhere. But in so many places, the conversations that I've had around this, actually, even amongst the people who you would not expect to listen, have been a part of what has taken that conversation generally forward, and has definitely kind of affected my own thinking. And I don't think there's a place where I have been easily trashed for talking complete nonsense.
All right, I think we'll stop Yeah, I have to apologize for all the questions I did not present. I also would like to make one request for the future. If we've had some of the questions or statements were extremely long. If you can try to, whenever you have something to say or to ask, these are supposed to be questions, start with the question and then do the rest, and try to keep it, to a few sentences and not, go on to 10 or 12 or 15. Just want to repeat, the book is called Post-Growth, Life After Capitalism. It's published by Polity. So if you'd like to get a hold of it and read it, it's, as I said, it's highly recommended and goes much more into detail than here. I think there's much more justice to Tim's ideas, although he's done a brilliant job tonight as well, to say it mildly. I'd like to thank Tim for taking his time to address.
It's been a pleasure, Matthew. I mean, it kind of, I guess one thing I would sort of say about the book is that we sort of approached this conversation in quite a sort of left brain way. And one of the things that I hope for the book, and I hope it will do for anyone who reads it, is to take us a little bit outside of that left brain, logical, rationalistic thinking, because our creative ideas and our sense of where the future is has to engage. To me, it's a sort of fundamental principle. It has to engage with the kind of poetry of life, much as Robert Kennedy did back in that speech in 1968.
All right. But once again, thank you. And I'd like to thank the audience and all those who remained with us the whole of the evening. And we'll see each other in about a month's time. So good night.
Thanks, Matthew. Bye.
Bye.